After the divorce, my ex-husband walked away and left me without a single dollar. From a woman who once had everything, I became a server at the St. Regis Atlanta, carrying trays of food through glittering hallways every day, serving people who lived in a world I once belonged to. Yesterday, during what seemed like an ordinary shift, I was assigned to serve a special guest, a billionaire. He sat alone, quiet, radiating the kind of presence only those accustomed to power and money possess. When I handed him the menu, he reached out to take it. And in that exact moment, my heart stopped. On his right wrist was a crescent-shaped birthmark, identical to mine, identical to the birthmark my son had, the premature baby who lived only a few hours, 30 years ago. I had buried that pain for 3 decades, cried until there were no tears left, learned how to live with a hollow space that could never be filled. In a voice trembling so badly I barely recognized it as my own, I asked his name. He answered calmly, Micah Rowe. That was the name I had given my son, the name engraved on a small gravestone I had stood before for years. I stood there, my hands shaking as I gripped the tray, staring at the man in front of me. He was sitting right there, alive, successful, and completely unaware of who I was. If you think this is just a coincidence, stay, because what I am about to discover next will make you ask, can a mother lose her child twice in the same lifetime? The St. Regis Atlanta does not hire women over 50 to serve in its fine dining restaurant. They prefer young women, bright smiles, clean pasts, untouched by life's wear. But when your resume contains the line, former wife of Preston Wainwright, one of Atlanta's most powerful attorneys, and when the people recommending you are high society women who once attended parties in your own mansion, exceptions are made, even when you are 52, even when your once chestnut brown hair is threaded with silver, even when the lines around your eyes no longer hide the years that have passed, years of laughter and of tears. My name is Alicia Rowe. For 5 years now, I have worked here, since the day Preston stripped everything from me in the divorce. Ironically, I now serve drinks to the very people who once sat around my dinner table. Most pretend not to recognize me. A few do, and offer pitying smiles, the kind that hurt more than indifference. I was once a promising pianist. I performed at Carnegie Hall at the age of 20. And now, my hands shake every time I carry a tray, afraid of dropping it over a small mistake, and even more afraid of the disappointed gaze of my manager, Shanice Cole. Shanice is one of the very few who knows my real story, not because she lacks professionalism. On the contrary, that soft-spoken black woman with a gentle Southern accent is fiercely serious about her job. But after hours, when the restaurant is empty and only the echo of cleaning remains, sometimes she lets me sit, hands me a cup of hot tea, and does not ask why my eyes are red. Some losses do not knock you down all at once. They don't kill you in a single day. They let you keep living, but every day feels like carrying an invisible shadow. No one sees it, no one asks about it, but it never leaves you. And I thought I would carry that shadow for the rest of my life, until that night. Alicia, you're covering the VIP section tonight, Shanice told me as I clocked in for the evening shift. Mr. Micah Rowe is in the penthouse. He rarely comes down to dine, but when he does, he expects flawless service and absolute discretion. I nodded, showing no emotion. Micah Rowe, tech billionaire, energy innovator, famously private. Everyone knows his name. Very few actually know him. I've served celebrities and powerful figures before. This was nothing new. The VIP dining area remained empty until precisely 8 p.m. He arrived alone, no entourage, no display. Tall, dark hair slicked neatly back from a broad forehead, he moved with quiet confidence, the kind that needs no validation. As I approached the table, I realized he was younger than I expected, early 30s. "Good evening, sir," I said, my voice steady with practiced professionalism. "May I recommend our wine selection?" "Water," he replied. "Still, and the chef's special menu." I placed the menu on the table, and as he reached for it, his sleeve rolled up slightly. In that instant, my breath caught. On his right wrist, a crescent-shaped birthmark, small but unmistakable, identical to mine, identical to the one my son had when he was born premature 30 years ago, the child who lived only a few hours before quietly leaving this world. The bottle in my hand nearly slipped. My fingers went numb. I tried to steady myself, but not fast enough. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice genuinely concerned, not annoyed. "Yes, sir, I'm sorry." I regained my composure, but my heart was pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. Throughout the evening I kept glancing at him, not just because of the birthmark. There was something else, terrifyingly familiar. The brow, the shape of his hands, and his eyes. Those eyes were mine. Not only the rare gray-blue color, sometimes silver under light, but the shape, the way the corners crinkled when he spoke to the sommelier, then his chin, a small cleft, exactly like Preston's, the way he held his fork, precise, deliberate, just like Preston. No, impossible. My son died. I held his tiny body. I felt the warmth leave him. I buried him in the Eastern Cemetery, in the Wainwright family plot, where after the divorce, I am no longer even allowed to step. I spent years in therapy learning how to survive, how to endure the grief, the trauma, the loss that cracked my marriage with Preston long before it ended. And yet, as the night deepened, the impossible thought clung tighter. Too many coincidences, the age matched, the resemblance undeniable, and the birthmark. When he finished eating, I cleared the plates, and I couldn't stop myself from asking the question burning in my throat. "Sir, please forgive my rudeness. May I ask your name?" He looked surprised, then amused. "You're serving me dinner without knowing who I am?" I mean your full name," I clarified, my heart racing. "Micah," he replied. "Micah James Rowe, Micah." The name we chose. The name etched on a small gravestone I had stood before for years. The world tilted beneath my feet. "Thank you, sir," I said, turning away before he could see the panic on my face. In the kitchen, I leaned against the wall and took deep breaths. Just coincidence. It had to be. People share names. Birthmarks are not unique identifiers. I was projecting, forcing myself to see connections that didn't exist, because my pain had never fully healed. But when I returned with his coffee, I saw him absent-mindedly rubbing the birthmark on his wrist while reading his phone. Exactly the way I do when lost in thought. The same unconscious gesture. "Is there anything else I can get for you, Mr. Rowe?" I asked, surprised my voice remained steady. He looked up at me, studying me. There was something in his gaze that felt like recognition, though I knew I was imagining it. "Have we met before?" he asked. "There's something about you, very familiar." "I don't believe so, sir," I replied. "I've worked at the St. Regis for 5 years. Before that I was married. My husband was Preston Wainwright, an attorney." Those words always tasted bitter. His expression shifted, just slightly. "Wainwright? From Harrington and Wainwright?" "Yes. Do you know him?" "Only by reputation," he said evenly. "Thank you for the exceptional service tonight, Mrs. Rowe." Alicia Rowe. I kept Preston's surname after the divorce, not out of affection, but because changing all the documents felt like yet another defeat I couldn't bear. As I walked away, I felt his gaze following me. When I glanced back, he was staring at his wrist, then at me, confusion flickering across his face. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay staring at the ceiling in the dark, counting every crack, the way I had counted every day since I lost my child. 10,950 days, 30 years, a lifetime my son never lived. Around 3 a.m., I turned on the light. I retrieved the small box, the few keepsakes that survived the divorce, the hospital bracelet, painfully tiny, a lock of soft black hair, and the only photograph, blurred but devastating. And there it was, clear, undeniable, a crescent-shaped birthmark on the right wrist, exactly where Micah Rose is, exactly where mine is. Tomorrow he will leave the hotel. Tomorrow I may lose my chance to know the truth, whatever it is, however terrifying. But one thing I know with absolute certainty, I will not survive losing my child a second time. I held the photo up to the light. The illumination passed through the aged paper, making the image nearly translucent. The baby's eyes were tightly shut, lips pressed together, but the wrist bore the crescent-shaped birthmark. "My son," I whispered into the darkness. "If it really is you, if there is still some path." I couldn't continue, but hope, that dangerous feeling I thought I had buried with my child, quietly took root in my chest. The next morning, I arrived at the hotel 3 hours early. My mind was like a wheel spinning madly, running circles around hundreds of possibilities, and each one was more absurd than the last. I had spent the entire night swinging between two extremes. On one side, telling myself I was delirious because old pain had never healed. On the other, planning how to get close to Micah Rowe without turning myself into a desperate woman, someone who could even be seen as unstable. I checked the hotel file. He wouldn't be checking out until evening, a tiny mercy from fate, giving me more time. When Shanice Cole came on shift, she found me carefully polishing glasses that were already gleaming. She stopped short, narrowing her eyes. In 5 years, I had never come in early when I wasn't scheduled. "Alicia, is everything okay?" Her voice dropped, concerned but cautious. "Couldn't sleep," I answered, not a lie. "Figured I'd come in early and get ahead." Shanice seemed temporarily satisfied, though still confused. "Mr. Rowe requested breakfast in his room. He's not coming down to the restaurant," she said, then handed me the order slip. "And he specifically requested that you serve him." My heartbeat skipped. "Requested me?" I tried to keep my tone normal. "Did he say why?" "No." Shanice shrugged, as if it were obvious. "Penthouse guests get what they want." Then she looked straight at me, her voice turning firm. "Alicia, whatever happens today, keep it professional. Mr. Rowe is one of the most important guests in this hotel." I nodded and took the room service cart. The small photograph in my pocket felt like it was burning against my side, both proof and a blade. Micah Rowe opened the door on the first knock. He was already dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, polished and sharp, as if he'd been awake for hours. A faint men's cologne lingered. Clean, cold. Everything about him radiated control. "Mrs. Rowe," he said, stepping aside to let me in. "Thank you for coming up yourself." "Of course, Mr. Rowe." I pushed the cart inside. The penthouse opened onto a sweeping view of the Atlanta skyline, but I barely saw the city. I only felt, clearly, that his eyes were tracking my every movement. I set the breakfast tray on the table near the glass windows, trying to keep my breathing steady, the way I used to when I stood before hundreds of people at Carnegie Hall. "Is there anything else you need, sir?" "Yes," he said. "Sit down with me." The professional mask I'd built over 5 years nearly slid off my face. "I'm sorry." "Please sit down." He pointed to the chair across from him. "There's something I want to talk about." I hesitated. This went against hotel policy, but curiosity and the fear of losing the chance outweighed caution. I sat down, extremely careful, barely touching the edge of the chair as if I might have to spring up and leave at any second. Micah Rowe studied me for a long time, then spoke slowly. "I rarely forget a face, Mrs. Rowe, but last night I couldn't figure out why you felt familiar. Until this morning." He reached for his phone, tapped a few times, then turned the screen toward me. A website appeared, an old photo from at least 20 years ago, me and Preston Wainwright at a charity gala, both of us smiling at the camera. I barely recognized the woman in the picture, polished, confident, radiant in an expensive gown, standing beside the man who would later discard me like an outdated accessory. "You used to be a pianist," Micah continued, "before you married Preston Wainwright. I started looking into Wainwright after our conversation. His name came up connected to a few legal issues I'm dealing with. His voice was normal, but his eyes were sharp as a blade. And that's when I found this photo." I curled my fingers lightly under the table so they wouldn't shake. "Mr. Rowe, I don't understand. What does this have to do with me serving your breakfast?" He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice, pulling me into the center of the question I feared most. "Last night, you noticed my birthmark." It wasn't a question. I stayed silent. "The same birthmark you have," he added, nodding toward my wrist, where my sleeve had slipped up without me realizing. My breath caught. Instinctively, I used my other hand to cover my wrist. "A crescent," Micah went on, his tone even, like he was presenting data. "A distinct-shaped birthmark is very rare. I looked it up. Less than 1% of the population has a birthmark with a clearly identifiable shape, and a crescent is one of the rarest." "Mr. Rowe," but he didn't stop. "You asked my name with an unusual level of interest. You watched me all evening. And this morning I found out you're the ex-wife of a man whose firm has been trying to win a contract with me for months." Micah paused, as if to make sure I heard the implication beneath his words. "So tell me, Mrs. Rowe, why are you interested in me?" There is a moment in life when you understand every safe exit is behind you. And ahead, there is only one door you're terrified to open. I could retreat, apologize for the misunderstanding, keep my professional smile, push the card out, tell myself, "Alicia, you're losing your mind." But then I saw his wrist. That birthmark felt like a call from 30 years ago, and I knew, if I didn't speak today, I would regret it until I died. I reached into my pocket, took out the photo, and set it on the table between us. Because of this, my voice, strangely, was almost steady. Micah picked up the photo. At first, his gaze remained full of suspicion, but then his expression shifted to confusion as he looked closely at the blurry hospital picture of a newborn baby. "I don't understand," he said at last. "My son," I replied. "Born premature 30 years ago. He lived only a few hours, or at least, that's what they told me." I took a deep breath, as if gathering the courage to stab straight into my own pain. "His name was Micah James Rowe." His eyes widened. "He had a birthmark," I continued, touching my own wrist. "Like yours, like mine." Micah set the photo down very carefully, as if even slightly too much force would make it crumble. "What are you implying, Mrs. Rowe?" His voice slowed, tightly restrained. "I don't know," I admitted, and even to me it sounded insane. "But these coincidences—" I gestured helplessly. "The birthmark, the age, the name, and the resemblance. You have my eyes, and Preston's chin." Micah stood abruptly and turned toward the window, as if he needed a wall of glass to keep himself from collapsing. "I was born to Nadine and James Kerr," he said, his voice tense. "I've seen my own birth certificate. This is—" He stopped, shaking his head. "Impossible." "I understand how it sounds," I said softly. "But before you dismiss it completely, ask yourself why you requested me this morning. Something in you is curious, too." His shoulders went rigid. He turned back, his face controlled even more tightly. "I was adopted," he said at last. "My parents told me when I was 16, but my birth certificate still lists Dr. Nadine as my biological mother. It doesn't mention the scenario you're talking about." A cold current ran down my spine. The possibility I feared most began to harden into something solid. "What is your birthday?" I asked, my voice turning hoarse. Micah looked at me as if he didn't understand why that mattered, then answered, April 14th. My heart stopped. My son was born on April 14th, 1995. Micah slowly sat back down, as if his legs had suddenly lost their strength. This can't be, he said, his voice smaller. Yes, I replied, my throat tightening. But it is. We sat across from each other in silence. The breakfast had gone cold long ago, lying between us like forgotten evidence. Finally, Micah spoke. Who was your doctor? He asked. When you gave birth? Dr. Lorraine Becker, I answered. She was an obstetrician at Emory University Hospital. Something flickered across his face. Nadine, my mother, was also an obstetrician at Emory, Micah said more slowly. She worked with a Lorraine Becker. The room seemed to tilt beneath my feet. Dr. Nadine Kerr, I whispered. The name suddenly felt frighteningly familiar. I remember her. She was there that night. She came after they told me my baby didn't survive. Micah sprang to his feet, agitation visible in every movement. It doesn't make sense, he said, pacing. Why would my mother... He stopped, corrected himself. Why would Nadine and Preston Wainwright, your ex-husband? Preston never wanted children, I said, the old pain rising like a scar being torn open. When I got pregnant, he was disappointed, and when the baby came early, with the risk of complications. I couldn't finish. Micah dragged a hand through his hair, a gesture so much like Preston's that my heart clenched again. I need to verify everything, he said, his voice turning cold, professional. DNA testing, medical records. If what you're suggesting is true, then... I know, I cut in. Mr. Rowe, I didn't come here to shatter your life. I don't want money. I don't want anything from you. I paused, inhaling deeply. I just need to know the truth. He looked at me for a long time. What exactly did they tell you about the baby? He asked. That he was too premature, I replied, carefully controlled. That his lungs weren't fully developed. I took a sip of water, trying to keep myself steady inside the memory. I was holding him. He was tiny but perfect. They said he died in my arms, but I was given heavy sedatives. Everything is hazy. Something softened in Micah's eyes, perhaps for the first time. The understanding of a child for a mother who had lost her baby. I have a meeting, he said at last, but I'll stay in Atlanta one more night. Tonight, we'll talk again. I nodded, gathering myself enough to stand. Mrs. Rowe, Alicia, he called as I reached the door. Don't tell anyone about this. Not yet. I heard the warning clearly in his voice. I won't. There are truths that don't arrive with thunder. They bleed out slowly, piece by piece, until you realize your entire life has been standing on a lie, and once you begin to see the shape of that truth, you no longer have the right to turn back. The next 3 days passed in a surreal fog. Micah checked out of the St. Regis on schedule, but rented a private apartment nearby. We agreed to wait for the DNA results before taking any action, though neither of us truly doubted what they would reveal. The truth was already too visible, in the crescent-shaped birthmarks mirroring each other, in identical brows, in unconscious gestures no one could learn from someone else. I still went to work every day at the St. Regis, doing familiar tasks while my mind remained trapped in an impossible reality. Shanice noticed my distraction, but she seemed to assume it was lingering trauma from seeing Preston again. She didn't ask more. On the 4th day, I received a text from Micah. The results are in. Meet me at the apartment at 7 p.m., address below. The apartment was in a high-security building overlooking a park. Even as a temporary place, it still carried the quiet luxury I had begun to associate with Micah. When he opened the door, I was once again struck by the strange reflection of myself in his face. How had I not seen it sooner? How had no one ever commented on the resemblance? "Thank you for coming," he said solemnly, leading me inside. The interior was minimalist but warm, with floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over Atlanta at sunset. On the coffee table sat an opened envelope. Micah gestured for me to sit, then handed me the stack of papers inside. 99.9998% mother-child relationship. I read it aloud, my voice catching. Even though I already knew, seeing scientific confirmation left me unable to speak further. "There's no doubt anymore," Micah said, sitting across from me. "You are my biological mother, and Preston Wainwright is my biological father." I set the papers down, overwhelmed by how final it was. "So, what do you want to do now?" I asked softly. "I've been thinking about that nonstop," he admitted. "Part of me wants to confront Preston immediately, force him to face what he did." His fingers tightened around his glass of water. "But I didn't build billion-dollar companies on impulse." That practicality, terrifyingly like Preston. "I've gathered everything," Micah continued, pointing to his laptop. "Nadine's journal, the DNA results, hospital records I managed to obtain. Enough for criminal prosecution, conspiracy, fraud, falsification of documents. Statutes of limitation might be an issue for some charges," he added, "but not all." "You want to have him arrested?" I asked, startled. "I want him to face consequences," Micah corrected, "whether through the law or otherwise." I looked at him, my son, but also a man raised in a different world, carrying my DNA, my birthmark, my eyes, yet possessing his own strength. "And Nadine?" I asked softly. "Her role in all this?" Pain flashed across his face. "Nadine died last year. Pancreatic cancer." He turned slightly away. "I can't confront her. Can't ask why she took part in this theft. And part of me is grateful for that." "Because you loved her," I said. "Yes," he answered, his voice going rough. "She raised me, loved me, was proud of me. I am who I am today because of her and James." He looked straight at me. "It took me days to reconcile that with the truth about what she did to you." I understood. I lost a child, and he lost the foundation of his entire life. "And Lorraine Becker?" I asked. "She's still alive." Micah nodded. "I tracked her down at a care facility in Hudson Valley, New York, early-stage Alzheimer's. Her clarity comes and goes." "I want to see her," I said immediately, surprising even myself with how certain my voice sounded. "I need to hear the reason directly." Micah nodded slowly. "I've arranged it. Tomorrow we can drive up there, if you're ready." The care facility sat in the Hudson Valley, surrounded by blazing red and golden autumn leaves. Micah drove a sedan more discreet than I expected. "Less attention," he explained. We barely spoke during the 2-hour drive. "The director said she's lucid today," Micah said as the car came to a stop. "But that can change at any moment." I nodded, full of anxiety. The facility was bright, smelling of disinfectant and plastic flowers. A staff member led us to the sunroom. Dr. Lorraine Becker sat there, thin, silver-haired, her hands lightly trembling in her lap. The sharp woman I once knew was now only a shadow. "Dr. Becker," the staff member said gently, "your guests are here." She turned, pale blue eyes studying us with curiosity. "Hello," she said. "Do I know you?" Micah sat down across from her. "I'm Micah Rowe. This is Alicia Rowe. We want to ask about a delivery case at Emory in 1995. "So many babies," she smiled vaguely. "So many mothers. Now they all blur together." I stepped forward. "Dr. Becker, do you remember me? I delivered a premature baby boy in April 1995. You told me my baby died." A flicker of recognition flashed, then was covered. "I'm so sorry for your loss, dear." "Except my baby didn't die," I said. "My baby is sitting right here." Lorraine's gaze wavered. Micah pulled up his sleeve, revealing the birthmark. "I think you remember this birthmark," he said, "and how you helped Dr. Nadine Kerr take me, falsify the death records." The color drained from her face. "Nadine," she whispered. "She's dead," Micah said. "But she left a journal." Sudden clarity returned to Lorraine's eyes. "You have to understand," she said. "It wasn't as simple as theft." "Then explain it," I said, my voice low but hard. "Why did you tell me my baby was dead?" Lorraine exhaled. "Your husband approached me first. He knew the pregnancy was high risk. He didn't want a child who might be disabled." Nausea rose in me. "He mentioned Nadine," she continued. "Said she'd just miscarried, desperate for a baby." "And you were blackmailed," I realized. Lorraine nodded. "Preston knew about an old mistake of mine. He threatened to ruin my career." "So you chose your career over my child." "I chose what seemed best for everyone at the time," she said weakly. "Except the baby was completely healthy," Micah cut in. "We found out after a few hours," she admitted, "but the plan had started. The forged records, another stillborn baby." "What did I hold?" I whispered. "A stillborn fetus," she answered, unable to look at me. "We reused." I shot to my feet, needing air, needing distance. 30 years of my mourning, built on a calculated lie. Micah continued. "The payments? Money, donations, a cabin," she said, her voice breaking. "I've had 30 years to regret it." I turned away from the window and lifted my hand to wipe the tears that had spilled out before I could stop them. "Did you ever think about telling me the truth?" I asked Lorraine, my voice trembling. "All those years, knowing exactly what you did to me." For the first time, she looked straight into my eyes. "Once," Lorraine said softly. "About a year later. I saw you at a fundraiser. You looked haunted. I almost walked up to you." She swallowed hard. "But Preston was standing beside you. He watched everything, watched everyone, like he was controlling the entire room. I knew what he was capable of." "You were afraid of him," I said, and even I could hear the certainty in that sentence. Lorraine nodded. Her admission almost dissolved into the air. "Yes. He made it clear that if the truth came out, he would destroy not only my career, but my entire life. And I believed him." When we left the care facility, leaving Lorraine small and collapsed in the pale afternoon light, I felt no satisfaction at all, no sense of closure, only a deep, cold sorrow for the years that could never be reclaimed, for 30 years stolen by one man's selfishness. In the car, Micah was silent. He processed everything we had just heard, like a machine grinding itself down. A long time passed before he finally spoke. She confirmed what we suspected. Preston staged everything. "Yes," I answered, "and now we know exactly what we're confronting him with." Micah nodded. Determination settled back onto his face like steel. "I've decided. We're going to see him. Tomorrow. No more waiting." Preston's corner office at Harrington and Wainwright occupied the entire 42nd floor of a gleaming glass tower in Buckhead, Atlanta, a silent boast about how high he had climbed since our divorce. The receptionist was a young woman polished to perfection, wearing a standard smile. When Micah introduced himself, her eyes lit up as if she'd just seen a real-life VIP. "Mr. Rowe, Mr. Wainwright is expecting you." Then her gaze slid to me, curious but polite. "I don't see an appointment for your accompanying guest." "She's with me," Micah said simply. No raised voice, no explanation, just the quiet authority of someone who had never been used to being questioned. The receptionist hesitated for only a beat, then nodded. "Yes, sir. Please follow me." We walked down a long hallway lined with expensive paintings, certificates, awards, photographs of Preston shaking hands with powerful people. I felt strangely calm. The anger and pain of the past few days were no longer surging. They had crystallized into something colder, harder, like a blade. Preston rose from behind his massive desk when we entered. His polite smile froze instantly when he saw me. "Micah," he said, recovering quickly. "I didn't expect you to bring company." His eyes narrowed. "Alicia, a rather unusual surprise." "Is it really a surprise, Preston?" I asked softly. He looked back and forth between us. Caution began to creep into every line of his face. "I'm afraid I don't understand." "We think you understand very well," Micah said. He closed the door behind him, firm. "Don't waste time pretending. Yesterday we had a very illuminating conversation with Dr. Lorraine Becker." All color drained from Preston's face. For one brief moment, he looked like a ghost, exactly the image I had imagined for 30 years. But then, Preston the lawyer returned. He swallowed, adjusted his expression, rebuilt the mask. "I'm not sure what you think you know, but we know everything," I cut in, my voice steadier than I expected. "We know the arrangement between you and Nadine Kerr. We know you bribed and blackmailed doctors to stage the death of our son." I drew in a breath. "We know you carried out the most cruel and inhumane deception a person can do to a mother." Preston sat down slowly. His face became unreadable. "These are very serious allegations, Alicia," he said, his calmness infuriating and completely baseless. "Is that so?" Micah stepped forward and set a folder on Preston's desk. "We have Nadine Kerr's journal describing the arrangement in detail. We have Lorraine Becker's confession, and we have a DNA test confirming I am Alicia's biological son, and Preston Wainwright's." Micah leaned in, emphasizing every word. "Your son." Preston stared at the folder, but didn't touch it, as if touching it would burn him. "This is absurd," he said, clinging to an excuse. "An elaborate con." "Look at me, Preston," I commanded, stepping closer. "Look at him." I pulled up my sleeve, revealing the crescent-shaped birthmark on my right wrist. Micah did the same. "Same eyes, same birthmark. Are you really going to sit there and deny what's plainly written on our faces?" Preston's gaze flicked back and forth, and this time, his mask truly cracked. "This is private," he said, lowering his voice. "Whatever you think happened 30 years ago, Not what we think," Micah cut in, cold. "What we know. The question is, what happens now?" A flicker of calculation appeared in Preston's eyes, the look I'd seen during our divorce negotiations, weighing risk, searching for an exit. "What do you want?" he asked. "Money? An apology? Or a public spectacle?" The way he spoke of 30 years of mourning like a settlement made fire surge through me. "You think you can buy your way out?" I hissed. "Buy us the way you bought Nadine and Lorraine?" "Be reasonable, Alicia," Preston said, arrogance surfacing. "What's done is done. Dragging this into the public eye won't benefit anyone." "It could benefit many other people you've harmed," Micah said, and opened another folder. "Do you know how interesting it is to read your firm's ethics violations? Skirting environmental regulations, suppressing evidence in class action lawsuits, offshore accounts manipulating tax law." Micah spread a series of documents across the desk. "Did you really think I'd consider hiring your firm without due diligence?" Preston went rigid. For the first time, he fully understood what we were holding. "You're threatening me." "No," I corrected, and to my surprise, my voice was very calm. "We're giving you a choice." I looked him straight in the eye. "A choice you never gave me. About my son." There are men who live their whole lives believing they always have an exit. A good lawyer always has words to slip through. A powerful man always has money to silence people. But there is one thing money cannot buy back: 30 years of a mother's life. And once the door is closed, the person trapped inside must choose: confess or be exposed. Micah nodded. "Option 1. We take the entire file, the fraud surrounding my birth and your firm's ethics violations, to the authorities and the media. Your career ends, your reputation collapses, and you may face criminal charges." "And option 2?" Preston asked, his voice tight. "You sign a full confession," I said. "You admit what you did 30 years ago. You admit Micah is your biological son, and you compensate for what you stole from us." "Compensate?" Preston raised an eyebrow. "You mean money?" "I don't want your money," I said, genuinely disgusted. "I want justice. I want the truth acknowledged." Micah leaned forward, eyes pinning Preston to the chair. "My terms. You resign from the firm immediately. You leave the practice of law entirely. And you transfer all of your shares in Harrington and Wainwright into a fund that provides legal support for mothers separated from their children through deception or coercion." Preston stared at Micah as if he'd been slapped. "You're asking me to give up everything I've built." "You're getting off easy," Micah said without mercy. "What you did is a crime. You deserve to be in prison." "This is extortion," Preston blurted, desperation showing. "No," I said. "This is the consequence of the choice you made 30 years ago, a choice that crushed other people's lives." I held his gaze, no longer shrinking from the authority that once terrified me. I held a dead baby in my arms, believing it was my son Preston. I lived in mourning for 30 years, while you knew the truth every day. Something shifted in Preston's face. Not quite regret, but the closest thing to regret he could offer. "I did what I thought was best," he said, softer. "The pregnancy was a surprise. Our marriage was already strained. When the child came early, with potential complications, it seemed like a clean solution." "Clean?" I repeated, almost unable to believe it. "You stole my baby and made me believe he died. There is nothing clean about that. It's monstrous." "Nadine and James Kerr gave the boy an opportunity we couldn't," Preston argued, gesturing toward Micah. "Look at what he's achieved. If he'd been raised by a struggling musician and a lawyer just starting his career, would he have become this?" "That was not your decision," I said, and the words cut through every excuse. "He was our son, my son." Micah looked straight at Preston. "And now we're here," he said, cold as steel. 30 years later, what's your decision? Public disgrace or private restitution?" Preston's eyes moved between us, calculating out of habit. Odds, loopholes, exits. I could almost see the gears turning behind his pupils, searching for a side door, a detour. But this time, there wasn't one. At last, his shoulders dropped slightly, as if his body understood. He was out of options. "I'll need time to draft the confession," Preston said, "and arrange the transfer of shares." "You have 48 hours, Micah replied immediately. "Our lawyer will review every line, and if you refuse—" Preston tried to cling to one last hope. I looked at him, then said very simply, "Then by this time next week, your name will be a symbol of one of the most inhumane frauds people have ever heard of. The choice is yours." We turned to leave. "Alicia," Preston called after me. I stopped at the door and looked back. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry," he said. "Not for the arrangement, but for your pain. I never meant to hurt you." That conditional apology almost made me laugh from bitterness. 30 years of my suffering reduced to an unintended consequence. "Your intention doesn't matter, Preston," I said slowly. "Only your actions and the lives you destroyed." When the office door closed behind us, I felt strangely lighter, as if I had just set down a burden I'd carried so long I'd forgotten how heavy it was. In the elevator, Micah stood beside me. We reflected faintly in the polished brass wall, mother and son, 30 years stolen, but somehow found again. "Are you okay?" Micah asked quietly. I exhaled, and for the first time, the words sounded true. "Yes," I said, "for the first time in a long time, I think I am." The truth had been spoken. Preston would pay. And most importantly, my son was alive, standing beside me, as we went down toward the future, whatever that future would be. The night after confronting Preston, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the darkness of my small apartment, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. And for the first time in 30 years, I allowed myself to feel, not remember, not think, but fully feel the anger I had buried for far too long. Around 3 a.m, I turned on the light. My hands trembled so badly I had to brace myself on the edge of the cabinet just to open the door. The box was there, the box I had taken out a few days earlier, opened and looked through the way people stare at an old wound. I pulled it down. The hospital bracelet, the small lock of hair, the blurred photo, wrinkled, thin, as if it would dissolve if I breathed too hard. All of it was a lie, I whispered to those items, as if they could answer. They lied to Mom. They took you and told me you were dead. My voice climbed, shaking with emotions spilling over the edge I could no longer hold back. I held a dead baby, a baby that wasn't mine, while my son. A sob burst from deep in my chest, raw, primitive, like an injured animal. I clapped a hand over my mouth, trying to smother it so the neighbors wouldn't hear. But the more I fought, the more it broke apart. Wave after wave of pain buried for 3 decades surged up. Without negotiation, without permission, I slid down to the floor, clutching the box to my chest, and cried in a way I had never allowed myself to cry. Not the quiet, controlled tears of mourning, but something wilder, more violent, all the years of misery, guilt, and the questions that had gnawed at me. That maybe if I tried harder, loved more, prayed fiercer, my son could have lived. And then I learned the truth. He did live. He lived all that time. While I woke up each morning with the weight of loss crushing my chest, while I stood under the shower, letting salt water blend into hot water so no one would hear me cry, while I avoided mothers holding their sons' hands in the park because even looking made me choke. My son was growing up. First birthday, first steps, first day of school, graduation. All the milestones I mourned as if they'd been buried with him. And they took them from me. Preston took them from me. Near 5 a.m, my phone rang. Micah. Alicia? His voice came through the speaker, low and urgent. I'm sorry to call this early, but are you okay? I don't know why, but I keep feeling... I couldn't speak. I just sat there, pressed the phone to my ear, and cried. I'm coming right now, he said. Then the call ended. He arrived exactly 20 minutes later, hair still wet, as if he'd just stepped out of the shower. Jeans, a t-shirt. For the first time, I saw him in anything other than a suit and business composure. I opened the door. Micah took one look at my face, and he didn't ask anything else. He stepped inside, hesitated for exactly 1 beat, as if still trying to find where the boundary was. Then he hugged me. I went rigid at first. Since learning the truth, we had kept distance, careful as if walking on shattered glass. But then, I let go. I let myself collapse into that embrace and sob against my son's shoulder. The child I never got to hold as he grew. The child I never got to watch become a man. I lost 30 years, I whispered, my voice breaking against his chest. 30 years, my son. 30 birthdays. 30 Christmases. I'll never get them back. I know. His voice went rough. I know. And I'm sorry. No. I pulled back slightly, looking at his face. You have nothing to apologize for. You didn't do this. Preston did. Nadine did. But not you. There are pains that, while we're living inside them, we think we've gotten used to. We think we're fine. We think we've moved on. But really, we only learned how to press it down. Until one day, the truth appears like a blade splitting open the ice, and we realize the most terrifying thing isn't losing. It's knowing you were robbed of 30 years of being loved. We sat quietly for a long time. The acknowledgement of what was lost and could never be restored sat like stone between us in the room. Finally, Micah spoke. His voice was uneven. I wake up every morning, and for the first few seconds, everything is normal. Then I remember, I'm not who I thought I was. He stood and walked to the window. For 30 years, I was Micah Kerr, Nadine and James's son. Now who am I? Micah Rowe? Micah Wainwright? I don't know anymore. You are Micah, I said softly, each word placed carefully. Your name was born with you, the name I chose. But what about everything else? He turned back. This time I clearly saw the raw pain in his eyes, the pain he'd hidden beneath professional calm. Every memory I have, every moment with Nadine and James, was built on a lie, a theft. No. I stood and moved closer to him. Their love for you was real. Nadine's involvement in this was a sin, but the way she raised you, the way she loved you, was real. How can you say that? His voice cracked. After what she did to you? Because she loved you, I said. So simply it surprised even me. I saw it in her journal. She carried guilt every day, but she also loved you every day. Those two things can both be true. Micah was silent, as if swallowing something bitter and burning. Last night, he said, I stood in front of the mirror for almost an hour, just staring at my own face, trying to find my features, your eyes, Preston's chin. And then I asked, what in me is me? What is just cells and genes? He lifted his hand and touched the crescent-shaped birthmark on his wrist. I used to think this birthmark was something unique, a part of what made me me. Now I know it's an identifier, proof of deception. No, I corrected, and rolled up my own sleeve, revealing my birthmark. It's proof of connection, proof that you belong somewhere, that you belong to someone. I hesitated, then said quietly, as if placing something fragile between us, that you belong to me. That word hung in the air. Mother. I hadn't dared to use it. We had always used Alicia or you, safer, less complicated. I don't know what to call you, Micah whispered. Nadine is my mother, in the way I've known that word. But you're my mother too, and calling you that feels like betraying Nadine. But not calling you feels like betraying you. Tears spilled over. You don't have to call me anything you aren't ready to call me, I said. We have time. We don't have time. His voice suddenly rose, full of desperation. That's the problem. We lost 30 years. 30 years I could have known you. 30 years you could have been my mother. He dropped heavily onto the couch, burying his head in his hands. And now people tell us, here's your mother, here's your son. Now figure out how to live okay. But I don't know how. I'm 30 years old. I run a billion-dollar company. I don't know how to be someone's son. I sat down beside him. I didn't touch him. I just sat close enough for him to know I was still here. And I don't know how to be the mother of a 30-year-old man, I said, my voice going hoarse. I only had you for a few hours before they took you. I never got to change your diaper, never got to feed you, never got to sing you to sleep. All those first things, I missed them. My voice cracked. So, we're both learning. And it's going to be messy. It's going to be awkward. But maybe that's okay. We sat like that in silence until dawn filtered through the windows, washing the apartment in soft gold and pale pink, as if the world kept moving calmly on while something inside us had collapsed. I saw a therapist, Micah said at last, since the day we got the DNA results. She says I'm going through an identity crisis, that my reaction is normal. I've been seeing someone too, I admitted, a different person from before. The old one specialized in grief. The new one is, I don't even know what to call it. I exhaled, mocking myself softly. Complicated joy? Happy pain? We both laughed a little. A thin, brief laugh, but enough to make the air in the room lighten for exactly one beat. My therapist suggested, "We should go together," Micah said. "Family therapy. It sounds early, but maybe it would help." "I think right now, anything that helps is worth trying," I replied. We fell quiet again, but this time the silence wasn't taut like a string. It felt like something had been acknowledged, that both of us were struggling, and therefore we didn't have to struggle alone. Preston kept his word. The Reeves Foundation for Family Justice was born, and Shanice Cole became its executive director. As for me, I left the St. Regis. One door closed, and I stepped into another chapter, a chapter where I no longer had to bow my head to people who once looked at me with pity. Micah and I started with the simplest thing, one dinner each week. No need to talk much, just to see each other, eat together, and learn how to let each other's presence become normal. But 3 months later, everything collapsed. That night, I had prepared an elaborate dinner, roasted salmon, candles, and even my most beautiful plates. The plates I used back then at elegant parties, and now I only wanted to use them to tell my son one thing. Mom had waited to sit and eat with you an entire lifetime. When Micah arrived, he stopped short right at the door. "This is too much," his voice tense. "You're always trying to make everything perfect. It suffocates." Each word fell like a slap straight across my face. I laughed, but it wasn't laughter. It was a sound breaking apart. "Then I'm sorry," I said, my voice turning cold with pain. "I'm sorry that, to you, having a mother who cares is suffocating." "I didn't ask for any of this," Micah exploded. "I had a life. I had parents. And now what do you want me to do? Pretend like the last 30 years never existed?" I stood frozen. "You're calling me you," I whispered, and then it felt like my heart was squeezed even tighter when I realized what came next. "No, you're not calling me you. You're calling me friend." Micah froze, as if he had just heard it too. "Alicia, I don't—" "Leave," my voice broke. "Please, just go." The door closed so softly it hurt more than a hard slam. I stood alone in the room. The candles were still burning, the salmon still fragrant, the most beautiful plates still there. And that dinner, no one ate. I let myself collapse. 2 weeks passed in a painful silence. No messages, no calls. I was angry and afraid and guilty for having pushed my son out the door. Then one night, at exactly 3 a.m, my phone rang. "Alicia?" Micah's voice was hoarse. He had been crying. I can't sleep, and—" "I'm coming," I said. I didn't even think. I was out of bed before shame or pride could pull me back. I found him sitting on the floor, surrounded by photo albums of Nadine and James. Everything was spread out like a life torn in two. "I'm looking at these," he said when I sat down beside him, "and all I can think is, she knew. Every birthday, every Christmas, Nadine knew my mother was out there, somewhere, believing I was dead." His face was soaked. "How am I allowed to love her when she did that to you?" I looked at my son, and for a moment, I didn't see a tech billionaire anymore. I only saw a child dragged away from the truth and raised inside an incomplete story. "Because love isn't simple," I said softly. "You can love Nadine for who she was to you, and you can be angry at her for what she did. Those two things can both be true. But that isn't fair to you. Micah, look at me." I waited until he raised his eyes. "Nadine loved you. She raised you. I can't hate her for that, because if I spend all my energy hating, I'll have nothing left to love you." I swallowed against the tightness in my throat. "And I already missed 30 years. I don't want to lose anything else." Micah cried harder, as if he finally had somewhere to fall. "I'm sorry for what I said. I don't know how to do this, and I'm afraid I'm going to ruin it." "My son," I said, very carefully with that word, as if placing a rare treasure into my own hands. "I waited 30 years. I can wait longer, as long as you need." I drew a deep breath. "So here's what I propose. We start over, slower, not trying to make up for what we lost, just building what we can have, from now on." Micah nodded, wiping his face. "I want that. I just need space sometimes, and I need to feel like I'm allowed to call Nadine Mom." "Even if that means you're not ready to call me that," I continued for him. "I understand, and it's okay. There are families that don't fall apart because they stop loving each other. They fall apart because they don't know how to love each other after something too big happens. And there are reunions that aren't like the movies. No soundtrack, no perfect hug right away. Just two people, standing in front of each other, carrying too many wounds, and having to relearn from the beginning a very small question. Where do we start again? And with what? Micah's 31st birthday came. For the first time in my life, I would be there. A week before his birthday, I called him. "I want to do something small, if you're comfortable." "Nadine always made chocolate chip pancakes for birthday breakfast," Micah said. "A tradition." "I can make that." On the morning of his birthday, we cooked together in my small kitchen. Micah squeezed orange juice. I stood by the stove flipping pancakes. "Nadine always burned the first one," Micah smiled. "She said it was tradition." "Then I'll burn it too," I said, and deliberately let the first one scorch. Micah laughed, this time real laughter. We ate in the morning light. No candles, no singing, just us and pancakes. "This is good," Micah said softly. "Better than I expected." Then he handed me an envelope. Inside was a photo of us at the foundation's opening. "Maybe we can start a new album," he said. "One for the next 30 years. "I want that," I whispered. "Mom?" His voice caught, as if he surprised himself with the word he had just said. I froze too. I recognized it the moment I heard it again. "Don't correct it," Micah said gently. "It feels right. Finally, it feels right." 9 months after we found each other, Micah called me, his voice trembling. "I found something in Nadine's things, a videotape labeled, 'For Micah, only open when you know the truth.'" We met at his apartment that night. The tape sat in the middle of the coffee table like an unexploded bomb. "Do you want me here when you watch it?" I asked. "Only if you want to." "Only if you want me here," I corrected, and I saw him nod slightly. Micah had bought an old machine just to play it. The screen came on. Nadine, thinner, weak from cancer, sitting in a hospital room. Clearly the video had been recorded a few months before she died. "My beloved son," her voice trembled but stayed clear. "If you're watching this, it means you know the truth, and I don't know where to begin to apologize." Nadine wiped her tears, her frail body shaking. "I wanted to tell you from the day you were 16, when I told you about the adoption. But I was a coward. I was afraid of losing you, afraid you would hate me." She paused, drawing a painful breath. "The night I held you for the first time, you weighed only 4 pounds, so tiny, perfect. And I knew right away, what I did was wrong. I stole you from a woman lying on the floor below, believing her baby had died." Her voice broke completely. "But when I looked at your face, I couldn't let go. I told myself I would love you enough for both of us. I would give you a good life, and I tried, my son. God is my witness, I tried." She looked straight into the camera, her eyes drenched. "But every birthday, I thought of her, of Alicia. I wondered if she remembered this day, if she still hurt, and I knew I was the one who caused it." Nadine leaned toward the camera, urgent. "Micah, you have to find her. You have to tell her I'm sorry. Tell her there wasn't a day that passed that I didn't think of her, not a night that I didn't pray she would find peace." She wiped her face, trying to steady herself. "And you need to know, I loved you. Every day. Every moment. You were the greatest gift of my life, even though I didn't deserve you." Her voice grew smaller, like a final confession. "My son, her son, loved by both of us. Tell her I loved you enough for both of us, and forgive me, because even that was never enough." The screen went black. We sat motionless. Tears ran down both our faces. Finally, Micah asked, his voice raw, "Mom, do you want to say anything?" I thought about all the anger, all the stolen years, all the nights I had begged and no one answered. But I also thought about something else. Nadine had loved my son, and that love, even born from sin, had still kept my son safe. "I want to say," I replied, and my voice trembled but did not drift, "Thank you." I wiped my tears, breathing hard. "Thank you for loving him when I couldn't. Thank you for keeping him safe. Thank you for letting him become the man sitting beside me today." I paused, as if I had to cross through my own heart. "And I want to say, I forgive her, not because she was right, but because if I hold on to hatred, it will keep taking more from us." I looked at Micah. "And we've lost enough already." Micah reached over. For the first time, he hugged me in a real hug. No hesitation, no caution, just a son holding his mother. "Thank you," he whispered, "for letting me love both of them." 1 year after we found each other, the Reeves Foundation held its official opening gala. Micah came to me with a proposal. "Mom, perform," he said. "One piece, something that means something to you." "Micah, I haven't performed in public in 30 years. "That's exactly why," he said softly. "It's the perfect symbol. Not making up the past, but taking a piece of you back." I thought about the 20-year-old girl I used to be, and how Preston had persuaded me to abandon music little by little for his career, for his image, for what he called marriage. "Okay," I said, "I'll do it." For the next 6 weeks, I practiced like someone who had just found lungs again. My fingers remembered what my mind thought it had forgotten: strength, softness, and courage, too. One day, Micah brought me an elegant dress, midnight blue, dusted with silver, matching my silver hair now. On the tag was only one letter, E. "For Mom's comeback," Micah said. On gala night, when my name was announced, I walked onto the stage, back straight. On my wrist was the bracelet Micah gave me, with a crescent charm glittering under the lights. I chose Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, a piece so beautiful it hurts, and so sorrowful it feels regal. When the first note sounded, the hall disappeared. Only the music remained, flowing through my fingers, saying everything I couldn't say with words. I played for the young pianist who had been pushed aside. I played for the mother who lost her son. I played for the woman who had to serve in the very world that once belonged to her. And somewhere in the melody, I played for the son who was stolen and found again. For Nadine, a woman torn between guilt and love. For Preston, the man who chose cruelty and had to live with it. And for a fragile possibility, but a real one, forgiveness and starting over. The final note fell like a closing statement. Silence. Then applause erupted, long pounding against my chest like waves. I stood and bowed. My eyes searched for Micah in the front row. He stood clapping, his face full of pride, and something deeper than pride. When I stepped down, he was already waiting. "Extraordinary," he said. "Thank you, my son, for pulling me back." And in that moment, under the lights and the applause, I understood. I would never get back the 30 years I lost, but I had taken back a part of myself, the part I thought had died with my son. 2 years after we found each other, Micah and I stood before a small stone in the cemetery. Micah James Rowe, April 14th, 1995. Beloved son. I used to come here every week in the first year, I said softly, then every month, then only on your birthday, until the divorce, when Preston forbade me to come. But you still came, Micah said, not as a question. Yes, in secret, bringing blue irises, until the caretaker said I was the only one who ever visited. Micah placed a small stone on the headstone, a Jewish tradition Nadine had taught him. So, what does this grave mean now? He asked. I looked at the stone, and it looked nothing like it used to. It's still a marker, I said. Not a sign of death, but a sign of a beginning. A place where one chapter ended, and another, much longer, began. We stood still as autumn leaves fell around us like quiet blessings. What are you thinking? Micah asked. That we can't take back the past, I replied. 30 years are gone, but we still have the future, and maybe that has to be enough. 3 years after we found each other, I sat in my new apartment, larger, brighter, with windows overlooking Piedmont Park. Micah insisted on helping me move here. Not because you need me, he said then, but because you deserve it. On the coffee table was the new photo album. Not to replace Nadine and James's old albums, but to sit beside them, like another life, coexisting. A photo of us at the gala. A photo in Tuscany when I accompanied Micah on a work trip. A photo from our first Thanksgiving, both of us trying to cook a turkey and burning it magnificently. My phone vibrated. A message from Micah. Dinner tonight? You cook? I'll bring wine? I smiled and typed back, Okay, but nothing fancy, just spaghetti. Perfect. I like that. 7? 7. Love you. I paused before sending, staring at the last 3 words. Once, they were something I said in my head 1,000 times, with no one to hear them. It took me 2 years to say them out loud, and another half year before Micah said them back. But now they came naturally, as if they had finally found where they belonged. The reply came immediately. I love you too, Mom. I stood and walked to the window. Outside, Atlanta stretched wide, full of possibility, full of life. Somewhere, Preston lived in quiet seclusion, cut off from the world he once ruled. Somewhere, in a cemetery, that small stone still lay there, marking a lie that had accidentally led to the truth. And somewhere very near, my son was on his way to dinner with his mother. Not perfect, not without pain. The years we lost were still a permanent void, never fully fillable. But what we had now, scarred, unfinished, was still a miracle. Because we found each other. Against every odd, through every lie, we found our way back. And today, that had to be enough. Today, that was everything. If you want to hear more stories like this, where justice isn't only punishment, but also healing, then subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and leave a comment. How far do you want Micah and Alicia's epilogue to go? See you in the next story.